In July of 2018, one of the most powerful women in the history of music stood on the coast of California, holding an urn that contained the ashes of her firstborn son. Tina Turner had survived almost everything a person can survive. She had survived poverty in rural Tennessee. She had survived one of the most infamously abusive marriages in show business. She had survived her own near-fatal attempt to end her life, a stroke, kidney failure, and cancer. She was, by any measure, a woman built out of pure endurance, the queen of rock and roll, seemingly unbreakable. But standing on that shoreline, scattering the remains of her son Craig into the Pacific, she was simply a mother facing the one loss no parent is ever prepared for. She would later call it the saddest moment of her life as a mother, and, heartbreakingly, it would not be the last. Because the story of Tina Turner's children is, in the end, one of the most tragic family stories in modern music. Tina raised 4 sons. 2 were her own by blood, and 2 she took in and raised as her own after marrying their father. She loved them. She was strict with them. She tried to shield them from the chaos of her own extraordinary and often terrifying life. And yet, one by one, tragedy came for nearly all of them. By the time the full story had played out, 3 of her 4 sons were gone, 2 of them dying before their mother, and the 4th left facing his own long battle with illness, largely out of public view. The woman who sang about survival, whose entire legend was built on rising from the ashes, would spend her final years burying her children. There is a bitter irony at the heart of all this. The world knew Tina Turner as the ultimate symbol of triumph, the abused wife who escaped, who reinvented herself, who conquered the globe on her own terms, and became an icon of female strength and resilience. Her life story was, quite literally, made into a hit movie about overcoming the odds. And all of that was true. But that public narrative of victory left out the private chapters that never made the highlight reel. The chapters in which the same woman who beat every external obstacle could not, in the end, shield the 4 boys she loved from the long shadow of the very trauma she had escaped. The public got the triumph. The family lived the tragedy. This is the truth about the 4 sons of Tina Turner, about the lives they led in the shadow of 2 of the most volatile and famous performers who ever lived, about the wounds that followed them out of that childhood home, and about the losses that broke even the unbreakable Tina Turner's heart. Let's begin with the eldest, the boy who was born when Tina herself was barely more than a child, and whose quiet sadness would haunt her to the very end. Craig, the firstborn son. Before she was Tina Turner, she was Anna Mae Bullock, a teenager from Nutbush, Tennessee, who had moved to Street Louie and fallen in love with the electric energy of the local music scene. And it was there, at just 18 years old, that she became a mother for the first time. Her firstborn son, Craig Raymond, was born in 1958. His father was not Ike Turner. It was a saxophonist named Raymond Hill who played in Ike's band, the Kings of Rhythm. Anna Mae's relationship with Hill did not last, and she was left as a very young single mother, at the very beginning of a music career that was about to explode into something world-changing. When she later married Ike Turner in 1962, Ike formally adopted Craig, giving the boy the Turner name. And so Craig grew up inside the whirlwind of the Ike and Tina Turner Revue, one of the most exciting live acts in America, but also inside a household defined, behind closed doors, by Ike Turner's violence. This is the part of Craig's story that is almost unbearable to consider. Because Craig, as the eldest child, was old enough to see and to understand what was happening to his mother. Tina Turner spoke about this years later, in an interview with Oprah Winfrey, and what she described is devastating. She said that the abuse she suffered took a visible emotional toll on her young son. She described how Craig would always look down, in sadness. Picture that. A little boy, growing up in a home where his mother was being brutalized, absorbing that fear and that helplessness into his own small body, carrying a sadness he was far too young to carry. Children who grow up witnessing domestic violence often bear invisible wounds that follow them for the rest of their lives, and by his own mother's account, Craig was one of those children. The sadness she saw in him as a boy never fully seemed to leave. It is worth pausing to consider what that childhood actually meant for a sensitive eldest child. Craig was old enough to understand, and yet far too young and too powerless to do anything about it. He could not protect his mother. He could not make the violence stop. He could only watch and absorb and learn a terrible lesson about how unsafe the world could be, even in the place that is supposed to be safest of all, one's own home. Psychologists who study these situations describe how children in violent households often grow up in a permanent state of hidden anxiety, always bracing for the next explosion, never able to fully relax, and how that early conditioning can shape a person's entire emotional life for decades afterward. Craig carried that from before he could even articulate it, and it seems to have settled into him as a quiet, lifelong melancholy that no amount of later stability could fully lift. Craig, for his part, grew up and did everything he could to build a stable, ordinary life, as far from the chaos of his childhood as possible. After graduating from high school, around the same time his mother was finally escaping her marriage to Ike, Craig joined the United States Navy, choosing structure and service, the kind of order and discipline that his early years had so badly lacked. Later, he built a quiet career for himself as a real estate agent in the Los Angeles area, working in Beverly Hills, living a life almost entirely outside the spotlight his parents commanded. He avoided the fame, the cameras, the music industry that had defined and damaged his family. He seemed, to the outside world, to have found his footing. By all appearances, he was a successful, functioning adult who had escaped the worst of his origins. But the quiet sadness his mother had noticed in him as a boy appears to have never fully released its grip. And this is one of the cruelest aspects of the kind of pain Craig carried. The way it can hide behind an ordinary, even successful, exterior. From the outside, there is often no visible crack. The career keeps functioning. The smile stays in place in the photographs. And the private struggle remains completely invisible, right up until the end. In July of 2018, Craig Turner died by suicide in his California home. He was 59 years old. There had been no obvious warning that his family could point to. In fact, Tina later said that in the time leading up to his death, Craig had seemed happy, that he had mentioned finding a girlfriend, that he had seemed to be in a good place. She was, she said, shocked, and she admitted that she still did not fully understand what had taken him to the edge. In her grief, Tina reached for the only understanding she could find. She came to believe that, more than anything, her son had been lonely. That loneliness, she suspected, was what had truly gotten to him in the end. It is a heartbreaking thing for any mother to conclude, that her child, for all the love around him, felt alone. In her public tribute, she wrote words that capture a mother's bottomless grief. She called it her saddest moment as a mother, and she wrote that on the day she scattered his ashes off the coast of California, she said her final goodbye to her son, but that he would always be her baby. She kept photographs of him smiling all around her. And she told herself, she said, that she could sense he was finally in a good place, at peace at last. Craig's death was the first of the great losses that would mark Tina Turner's final years. But he was not the only one of her sons who carried the scars of that turbulent childhood, and the brother closest to him in age would follow a strikingly similar path of early struggle, before a very different kind of tragedy claimed him too. Ronnie, the only child of Ike and Tina. In October of 1960, Tina gave birth to her second son and her only biological child with Ike Turner. They named him Ronald, but everyone called him Ronnie. He was, in a sense, the one child who was fully and completely the product of that legendary and volatile union, the living link between two of the most electric performers in American music, and he would spend much of his life wrestling with the weight of that inheritance. Ronnie grew up in the same chaotic household as his brothers, and like Craig, he seemed to carry its damage with him. By his mother's own accounts, Ronnie struggled with substance abuse and with legal troubles as a teenager and a young man, particularly in the difficult period surrounding his parents' bitter divorce in 1978. It is not hard to understand why. These were children raised amid genuine violence and instability, watching their family fracture in the most painful way. And several of them turned, understandably, to self-destructive paths as they tried to cope with wounds that no child should ever have had to endure. But music was in Ronnie's blood, and eventually he found his way to it. He became a musician in his own right, playing bass guitar in a band called Manufactured Funk, and for a time he performed with his parents' bands as well, stepping onto the very stages that had made his family famous. He even appeared briefly in the 1993 film about his parents' lives, the acclaimed biopic that told the story of Tina's rise and her escape from Ike, playing a small part in the dramatization of his own family's history. There is something poignant in that. A son appearing as a background figure in the movie version of the childhood that had shaped and scarred him. In his later years, Ronnie stepped back from music somewhat and worked, like his brother Craig, in real estate. He married a French singer named Afida Turner, a colourful and outspoken public figure who would become fiercely devoted to the Turner name, and the two remained together for years. Afida later shared a striking and painful detail about how protective and how wary Tina could be even about her own son. According to Afida, Tina once warned her about staying with Ronnie, cautioning that he might turn out to be like his father. It is a chilling thing for a mother to say about her own child, and yet it speaks volumes about the depth of the fear and the trauma that Ike Turner had left behind, a shadow so long that Tina could see it stretching toward the next generation, worried that the violence she had escaped might somehow have been passed down. Whether or not that fear was fair to Ronnie, it reveals just how thoroughly Ike's abuse had marked the way Tina saw the world, and even the people she loved. By many accounts, Ronnie eventually found a more settled place in his life, but tragedy was waiting for him too, this time in the form of illness. Ronnie Turner was diagnosed with cancer, colon cancer, a diagnosis that would ultimately prove fatal. In December of 2022, Ronnie died from complications related to the disease. He was 62 years old. For Tina Turner, it was an almost unimaginable second blow. In the span of just over 4 years, she had now lost both of her biological children. Craig, her firstborn, in 2018, and now Ronnie, the son she had shared with Ike, in 2022. She poured her grief into a public tribute, writing that Ronnie had left the world far too early, and that in her sorrow she closed her eyes and thought of him, her beloved son. There is a particular cruelty in the order of these losses. Parents are not supposed to outlive their children, and Tina Turner, who had survived so much, was now being forced to survive the two greatest losses of all, one after the other. And here is the detail that makes the timing almost unbearably poignant. Tina Turner herself was, by this point, gravely ill, in the final chapter of her own long battle with serious health problems. Over her last decade or so, she had endured a remarkable series of medical crises. She had suffered a stroke and had to relearn how to walk. She had battled intestinal cancer. Her kidneys had failed, and she had undergone a kidney transplant, the donated organ given to her by her devoted husband, Erwin Bach, in an extraordinary act of love. She was, in her final years, a woman whose body was worn down by decades of hardship and illness, fighting to hold on. She would live only about 6 more months after Ronnie's death. She died in May of 2023, at the age of 83, which means that in the last years of her extraordinary life, this woman who had given the world so much joy and so much fire was privately enduring the deepest sorrow a human being can know, the loss of her children, even as her own body was failing her. The public saw the icon, the legend, the survivor, celebrated in a hit stage musical and a documentary and showered with lifetime achievement honors. Privately, she was a grieving mother, running out of time, saying goodbye to the sons she had brought into the world before saying her own final goodbye. There is a particular loneliness in that kind of grief, born behind the mask of public triumph, and Tina carried it with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else in her remarkable life. But Tina's story as a mother did not begin and end with the 2 sons she bore, because there were 2 more boys she raised as her own, sons who came to her not by blood but by circumstance, and their stories are threaded with their own kinds of hardship and loss. Ike Jr. and the sons she took in. When Tina married Ike Turner in 1962, she did not only bring her own son Craig into the marriage, she also became a mother to 2 boys that Ike had fathered with a previous partner, a woman named Lorraine Taylor. Their names were Ike Turner Jr. and Michael Turner. And Tina remarkably, took both boys in and raised them as her own children, adopting them into her heart alongside her biological sons. Think about what that says about her, given everything else that was happening in that household. Here was a young woman, herself the victim of a brutal marriage, still barely into her 20s, and she chose to open her home and her heart to two children who were not hers by blood, the sons of her husband and another woman, and to raise them as fully her own. It was an act of real generosity and maternal instinct, made under circumstances that would have overwhelmed almost anyone. In the family portraits from that era, there are 4 boys, not 2, and Tina made little distinction between them. As one of the sons later recalled, she really took to raising them personally because that was, to a certain extent, her happiness. In the midst of a marriage that brought her so much pain, motherhood appears to have been one of the few genuine sources of joy and purpose she had. She was, by their accounts, extremely strict, insisting on chores, on discipline, on the whole family eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner together at the same time, trying to impose order and normalcy on a household that was anything but normal. In a home ruled by her husband's unpredictable violence, Tina seems to have tried to build, for her boys, small islands of routine and stability, the ordinary rituals of family life that might give them some sense of security amid the chaos. Ike Turner Jr., born in 1958, was the son who most followed in his famous parents' musical footsteps. From an early age, his talent was obvious. His family later recalled that there was not an instrument he did not want to play. He started on drums, but when his mother, Tina, insisted that he break down his entire drum kit after every single practice, he grew tired of the hassle and drifted toward the keyboard instead, and eventually toward the technical side of music. He came to help run Bollock Sound Studios, the recording studio his father, Ike, had founded, and he became a genuinely sought-after and respected sound engineer and producer in his own right. His talent was real, and it was recognized at the highest level. In 2007, Ike Turner Jr. won a Grammy Award for Best Traditional Blues Album for his work producing his father Ike's final album. For a brief period, he also worked as a sound engineer for his mother Tina after she left Ike, though that professional collaboration was short-lived. He had, in the technical mastery of music, found a way to honor the extraordinary gifts that ran in his family while stepping back from the punishing glare of the stage itself. But Ike Jr.'s life carried its own deep sadness, particularly when it came to his relationship with the mother who had raised him. Because after Tina's divorce from Ike Sr. and her rise to solo superstardom, Ike Jr. found himself painfully estranged from her. In interviews over the years, he spoke with real anguish about the distance that had grown between them. As far back as 1985, he described calling his mother's management office again and again, 10 or 15 times, leaving message after message and never once hearing back. He said he knew she was busy, but he did not understand why she would not call him. He insisted that he loved her, that she had brought him up, that she was his mother. By his own account in later years, he and Tina had not really been in contact since around the year 2000, an estrangement that stretched on for roughly 2 decades until her death. It is one of the more painful threads in this family's story, and it is worth trying to hold it with some compassion for everyone involved, because there are no simple villains here. From Ike Jr.'s side, the pain was real and understandable. A son who had been raised by a woman he loved, now shut out and unable to reach her, left wondering what he had done to deserve the silence. But from Tina's side, the picture is more complicated too. Ike Jr. was, after all, the biological son of the man who had abused her for years. The man whose very name and face were bound up with the worst suffering of her life. It is not hard to imagine that maintaining closeness with Ike's children, however innocent those children were, may have been genuinely difficult for a woman working so hard to leave that entire chapter of her life behind. Neither of those truths cancels the other out. A son can be genuinely wronged by an estrangement, and a mother can have genuinely painful reasons for the distance all at once. That is the tragedy of it. Ike Jr. also spoke openly about the neglect he felt growing up amid his parents' whirlwind careers and about the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father. He had been taken in and raised by Tina as a boy, And yet in adulthood he found himself shut out, longing for a connection to the woman he considered his mother, a connection that never fully came back. When Tina died in 2023, Ike, Jr., had reportedly not spoken to her in years, a wound that, by then, could never be healed. And then, in a final devastating chapter, Ike Turner Jr. himself died. In October of 2025, just one single day after his 67th birthday, Ike Jr. passed away at a hospital in Los Angeles. His health had been declining for years due to severe heart problems, and he had suffered a stroke just weeks earlier, in September. The cause of death was kidney failure. His passing meant that 3 of Tina Turner's 4 sons were now gone: Craig, Ronnie, and now Ike Jr., a staggering accumulation of loss for one family to bear, which leaves only one of Tina Turner's 4 children still living. The son whose life has been the quietest and the most shadowed of them all, and about whom the public knows the least. Michael, the last surviving son. The 4th of Tina Turner's sons was Michael Turner, Ike Jr.'s younger brother, the other boy that Ike had with Lorraine Taylor, and the other child Tina took in and adopted as her own. And of all 4 sons, Michael's life has been lived the furthest from public view. Very little is known about his professional life or his personal story, because he never sought the spotlight, and the family has kept his struggles largely private. But the fragments that have emerged paint a picture of real and prolonged hardship. Michael, by the accounts of his own family, struggled with addiction as an adult. Another of the Turner children who seemed to carry the wounds of that turbulent childhood into a difficult adulthood. And his health, over the years, has declined severely. His brother Ike Jr. revealed in interviews that Michael had suffered multiple strokes and seizures, and that he had come to rely on a wheelchair. For a long stretch, Michael has reportedly lived in a care facility, a convalescent home in Southern California, requiring ongoing medical support. His has been a life largely defined by struggle and by illness, lived far from the wealth and glamour that his family name might suggest. There was, by some accounts, painful distance here too. Ike Jr. indicated that while Tina supported Michael financially, helping to provide for his care, she did not visit him at the facility where he lived. It is a complicated and sorrowful detail, and it would be easy to judge it harshly, but it deserves the same compassion as the rest of this story. We do not know what passed between them, what old wounds or exhaustion or heartbreak shaped those choices. What we do know is that Tina made sure her son was cared for and provided for, even from a distance, which is its own form of love, even if it was not the form Michael may have longed for. It speaks to the fractures that ran through this family, even amid the love that clearly existed. Tina Turner was, by every account, a devoted mother in the years she was actively raising her boys, strict and loving and deeply invested. Her sons themselves described how she personally took to raising them, how she enforced routine and discipline and family meals, how she tried to give them structure in a chaotic world. But the traumas of her own life, the demands of her staggering career, and the deep wounds left by her marriage to Ike seem to have created distances in later years that were never fully bridged with several of her children. The mother who held them so tightly as boys could not always hold them as men. Today, following the deaths of his 3 brothers and his mother, Michael Turner is the last surviving member of that group of 4 boys who once posed together for family photographs in the early 1970s. 4 sons of one of the most famous couples in music, smiling for the camera before life scattered and diminished them one by one. He lives quietly, out of the public eye, carrying whatever memories remain of a childhood that was equal parts glamour and pain. He is the last one left, the sole survivor of a family that has known more than its share of loss. The truth about their lives. When you step back and look at the whole of it, the story of Tina Turner's 4 children is almost overwhelming in its sadness. 4 boys, raised inside one of the most electrifying and one of the most violent households in the history of American music. 4 boys who, in different ways, carried the damage of that upbringing with them for the rest of their lives. And a mother who, for all her legendary strength, could not fully protect them from it, and who ultimately outlived 2 of them, with a 3rd dying not long after her. It would be easy, and it would be wrong, to reduce this to a simple story of a bad mother, because that is not the truth. The truth is far more complicated and far more human. Tina Turner was herself a survivor of profound trauma. She was a teenage mother. She spent years trapped in a marriage marked by terrible abuse, fighting simply to stay alive, at one point attempting to end her own life to escape it. When she finally broke free, she had to rebuild everything from nothing, clawing her way back to a solo career that would eventually make her one of the biggest stars in the world. A woman fighting that hard just to survive, and then to succeed, was fighting a battle that inevitably took something away from her ability to be present in every corner of her children's lives. She did not have the luxury of an easy, stable home to offer them, because she had never been given one herself. And the children in turn inherited that trauma. This is one of the quiet, devastating truths that the story of the Turner family illustrates so painfully. The damage done inside an abusive home does not stay contained to the two adults at its center. It radiates outward, into the children who witness it, who absorb the fear and the instability into their developing minds, and who so often carry those wounds into their own adult lives, into their own struggles with addiction, with depression, with loneliness, with an inability to feel safe in the world. Craig's lifelong sadness, Ronnie's youthful struggles, Michael's hardships, the estrangement that grew between Tina and the sons she had raised, all of it can be traced, at least in part, back to the violence and chaos of those early years, a poison passed quietly from one generation to the next. And yet, running through all of that pain, there was also real love. Tina Turner called the births of her sons some of the happiest moments of her entire life. She spoke of Craig with a tenderness that could break your heart, of keeping his smiling photographs around her, of sensing that he was finally at peace. She grieved Ronnie as her beloved son who had left the world too soon. She took in two boys who were not her own by blood and raised them as fully hers, cooking their meals, enforcing their bedtimes, trying to give them the structure and the love she believed they needed. The love was real. The tragedy is that love, even a mother's fierce love, is not always enough to undo the damage that a violent world inflicts on the people we cherish most. Tina Turner died in May of 2023, having lived one of the most remarkable lives of the 20th century, a life of almost mythic triumph over adversity. But behind the triumph, in the private chambers of her own family, she knew a sorrow that all her strength could never conquer. She rose from the ashes again and again on the world's stages, but she could not save her own children from the fire they had all been born into. And that, in the end, is the truest and most heartbreaking measure of what fame and fortune could never buy her. Not the safety of the four boys she loved most in the world. There is a lesson in this story that reaches far beyond the Turner family, and it is worth saying plainly. We often look at the children of the rich and famous and assume they must have been handed easy, gilded lives, that wealth and privilege must have insulated them from ordinary human suffering. The story of Tina Turner's sons is a stark reminder of how false that assumption can be. Money could buy houses, and comfort, and care, but it could not buy back a safe childhood. It could not undo what these boys had witnessed. It could not lift the depression, or cure the addiction, or heal the estrangement, or reverse the illness. The Turner children had access to resources that most people can only dream of, and it protected them from almost none of the deepest human pains. Their tragedy was not a lack of money. It was a lack of the one thing no amount of fame can guarantee, which is a childhood free of fear, and a life free of the long shadow that fear casts. Craig, Ronnie, Ike Jr., and Michael, the last one left. 4 sons of the Queen of Rock and Roll, and a story that reminds us that behind even the most dazzling legend, there can be a depth of private grief that no spotlight ever reveals. Tina Turner gave the world an image of unbreakable strength, and she earned that image honestly, through more suffering than most people could survive. But the final quiet truth of her life is that even the strongest among us cannot always protect the people we love most. And sometimes the greatest heartbreak of all is simply outliving the ones we brought into the world. The subject of suicide and loss touched on in this story is a difficult one, and if you or someone you know is struggling, please know that support is available and that reaching out for help is always worth it. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more of these fascinating and human stories.